Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Joanne Lasosky, journalism educator and author, and we are back to discuss issues of importance to the South Caucasus. With me today is former ambassador to Azerbaijan, Richard Kauzlarich. He is a distinguished visiting professor at the SCAR School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, as well as interim director of the Peace Operations Policy Program there at George Mason. He's also former National Intelligence Officer for Europe. So we're very grateful that you're here with us today, Mr. Ambassador.
Always a pleasure, and I enjoy the interviews very much. So
great
fun.
Thank you. Just last week, when our new President Biden visited the State Department, he claimed that America is back. What effect might this statement have on priorities for Azerbaijan?
Well, I think it was important that his basically first visit, to a U.S. government organization was the Department of State, and I think the message, first of all, as a former Foreign Service officer, I know my colleagues, both retired and active, saw that as a sign of support for them as professionals. We've gone through a very tough 4 years, and I think that was an important message to send. But I think beyond that personal connection, the idea is that the U.S. is going to be back diplomatically, going to take a more activist role in terms of leadership on specific issues like climate change, but more broadly, kind of in a dramatic departure from the Trump administration, look to multilateral partners to cooperate with in addressing the real problems that exist in the world today. So, I think on the one hand, for the professionals at the State Department, with the new Secretary of State and with the President and the Vice President, I'll say they were both
right
there. That is really important. But I think also for people looking at the United States from abroad, they have seen a very clear signal that the U.S. is going to be more engaged rather than less internationally, and to be doing it in ways that I think are more consistent with our traditional pattern of emphasizing diplomacy, multilateral organizations, and defending basic principles of human rights.
Might we see a different priority for Azerbaijan from this administration?
That I've had that question several times, and I think the honest answer is we don't know yet. Honestly, Azerbaijan as a single country is not that important in the broad scheme of things and the priorities that the Biden administration will have. And that's nothing to take nothing away from the importance of the U.S.-Azerbaijan relation. It's just that the officials who are responsible and will be responsible below the level of the Secretary of State are not all in place yet. And sort of how the foreign policy of the U.S. as a whole comes together and where particular countries fit into that, I think is still unclear. But two things I think we can count on. One, deep concern that Armenia and Azerbaijan not go back to war. That tragic situation at the end of last year does not need to be repeated and should not. So that would be one priority. And second, I think there's going to be and this was happening for other reasons, there's going to be a shift in the priority given to energy relations, not just Azerbaijan, but in the region as a whole, and certainly globally, with the emphasis on climate change and making progress in that regard. We're seeing, if you look at the executive order on climate change that was released now about 10 days ago, extremely detailed and clear commitment to move away, I think, too rapidly from carbon-based energy. I think the gas that the United States produces and Azerbaijan produces is going to be necessary even in a transition. So you can't simply, announce one day it's going to be totally renewable. But that whole emphasis that from the time that I was ambassador up until the end of the Trump administration on energy is kind of almost the key element in U.S.-Azerbaijan relations. That will change, and I think Azerbaijan just needs to be prepared that they're going to be operating in a different energy space than they were, 5 years ago, because the world is changing. The commitment to low carbon, if not no carbon development, is there, and Azerbaijan has to be in a position itself to set new priorities and a new basis for their economy.
I definitely want to get back to the climate change issue, but before that, I want to talk to you a little bit about President Biden's relationship with Vladimir Putin. He chatted with him for the first time last week, and he brought up several issues that had been left on the table for a long time. However, no mention of Karabakh. So it's obvious that things will be different between the new U.S. administration and Russia. What do you foresee for the U.S.-Russia relationship?
Well, maybe just to take the Karabakh issue to start with, and I'm very critical of Russia's role in the world globally, and in particularly in the South Caucasus. But in terms of cooperation with the United States and France as co-chairs of the Minsk Group, people may want to debate motivation and, are they serious or not? But it's been one of those areas where U.S. and Russian cooperation has, at least at the rhetorical level, been almost identical. And the cooperation, within that framework has been very good. A colleague of mine who's far more an expert on Russia than I am, kind of quipped. He said, the only two areas that until the Biden administration, announced the shift in the relationship where U.S. and Russia could cooperate was space and Karabakh. That may be an extreme formulation, but I think that what we're going to see is emphasis in terms of U.S.-Russian relations on other issues like human rights, and on getting the whole nuclear weapons framework back where it belongs in terms of open skies, test ban treaties, and trying to move beyond that. Sadly, we noted on Saturday the death of George Shultz, former Secretary of State, one of my great heroes. And I think there was no Secretary of State some people will quibble with me on this, that was more committed to dealing with this nuclear standoff that we inherited from the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. What he did during the Reagan administration was really quite remarkable. Condi Rice's op-ed piece in the Washington Post yesterday was a reminder of that. But I think we're going to be, tackling a new global emphasis on human rights with Russia, and we're also going to be tackling a renewed commitment to dealing with the nuclear weapons ban. I don't know what Biden and Putin said, but it couldn't have been a happy conversation on the human rights issue. That's probably two words that didn't pass Donald Trump's mouth in any conversation that he had with Putin. But Biden, I think, is going to be pressing that. More sanctions. I don't know. You sort of wonder at some point, is there anything left to sanction, given, starting with the whole Crimea, the Ukraine issue, we've gone through round after round. in the Congress, sanctions seem to be the knee-jerk reaction to any problem dealing with Russia. We'll put more sanctions on. But I think it's going to be a long-term struggle. It's going to be a difficult relationship, but there will be, I believe, an effort to broaden opportunities for cooperation. So we get beyond space, we get into nuclear weapons, and then I think, looking at practically, and this is a very operational issue, the Karabakh thing. How can the U.S. and Russia cooperate in the new situation that exists in the South Caucasus? Because I think we can get into this in more detail too. I think Russia is coming to understand that they alone are not going to be able to, with the small peacekeeping operation that they have, deal with all the problems that are going to be associated with implementation of the ceasefire from last November. And I would hope, as we found in the Balkans, that the U.S. and Russia and Europe can cooperate in working to sustain that peace.
So is it possible that the Biden administration will be stronger against Russia than even Obama?
Times change. I mean, we're in a totally different environment now. The Crimean Ukraine situation has gotten worse, not better. Certainly, there will be a tougher line coming out of Washington about human rights issues, as I said earlier. There will probably be what Moscow perceives as a toughening of the U.S. position within NATO and in cooperation with the EU. I think Russia was quite happy with the dysfunctional relationship between the Trump administration and our European partners, both individually and collectively. I think that's going to change. And so, if from Putin's point of view, I don't think he sees many positives, at least at the beginning, coming out of this relationship, and perhaps even more pressure, and as I said, more cooperation with European countries on this score. I was a little disappointed in the Borrell visit to Moscow. The EU had just came back from there, and it was an opportunity, I think, for the EU to take a stronger position than apparently they did. All I have is the media to refer to on that. But it's going to be a test for the United States and Europe on how much cooperation we, in fact, can have regarding Russia. One thing to watch for too, and in the framework of less importance on energy, is just how strong the Biden administration is on the Nord Stream gas pipeline, which kind of surprising to me. Trump was very someone who wasn't very tough on Russia in other areas, was very tough on them when it came to this gas pipeline. But this will be another. How the U.S. will engage with both Europe and Russia on this will be another test.
I'd like to now, Mr. Ambassador, talk a little bit about the Russian protests. They have been mentioned by President Biden as being unacceptable, and they have now been put on hold until the spring, unlike Belarus, which is people have been protesting since August. What do you think is behind this strategy to put the protests on hold, and what might change if Navalny can keep these protests alive until the election in September?
Well, I don't pretend to understand the motivation for these. I mean, looking even at the Belarus situation, I'm surprised that they've been sustained for as long as they have in the face of extraordinary pressures. And one thing that's very different about these protests and the ones in Moscow is the visibility of both the demonstrations and some of the issues that lie behind them that are stimulating popular concern in Russia. I mean, Navalny, look, he's horribly treated. I mean, there's no getting around it. He should be released right away on his own merits. But behind that is this whole question of corruption, and the fact that in a very, I think, creative way, Navalny and his supporters was able to use the corruption issue and the visibility on social media of, Putin's palace or whatever you want to call it, to a public which already was well aware of corruption in their own society, a public that still is, damaged as many publics around the world by the pandemic. A public which has economic problems in front of it, in part because of sanctions, but also because the Russian economy depends almost exclusively on oil and gas exports, which don't bode well for the future. And so, I think that the situation in Russia, who controls when demonstrations take place and when they don't, what the popular mood will be when the weather is better in spring. I think what was striking, at least from, again, back to the visibility point of view, was how widespread these demonstrations were. It wasn't just kind of focused on a few blocks in the center of Russia in St. Petersburg, but it certainly went far beyond that. And again, captured some of this otherwise perhaps invisible societal unrest that was going on in Russia itself. I'm not a Putin expert, so I'm not going to try to speculate on what he may or may not do, but I think he suffers from the same challenge that any leader who's been, in power for as long as he has. And the expiry date on his on his barcode is, has run out. He's just been there for far too long, and it becomes more difficult for leaders in that position to respond in creative ways as they might have earlier in their tenure. So great mystery, what happens in the spring, but something will happen. I mean, there will be, I don't think this is going to go away, but I'm not entirely clear what the U.S. can do or should do. I think this is, I would say this is up to the Russians, the Russian people. And, we're already being blamed for having organized the response. Right. And that, I guess, that just goes with the territory. You shouldn't be surprised. But I don't think we need to overextend our involvement in the domestic political and social situation in Russia. We can support Navalny, we can support his release, we can support free press and observance of basic human rights. That's fine, and I think we should, again, with our allies. I would hope the EU will come around to a stronger position. But I'm just not sure what more we can do, except more sanctions. Mm-hmm. That's the fallback position, I guess.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I want to turn a little bit now to look at another country of interest to the South Caucasus, and that's Turkey. The president's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, talked with President Erdogan's spokesman last week, and despite avoiding communication with Turkey for the first couple of weeks of the administration, one of the topics discussed was Karabakh. What does that tell you about what the plans might be for U.S. and Turkey relations?
Yeah, that's probably, in terms, and I will put Russia and Turkey in the context of U.S.-European relations, because so much of the interaction revolves around that. Turkey is probably, in some respects, more important than Russia for the United States because, A, they're a NATO partner, We have a long-standing, goes through fits and starts, but long-standing bilateral relationship and working with Turkey on a whole range of issues. When I was ambassador in Bosnia, the Turkish brigade and the stabilization force was a very positive force in implementing the Dayton Peace Accord. So we know we can work with Turkey in difficult situations. And now you add to it the whole Middle East and Syria and Libya. Suddenly Turkey seems to be everywhere. And I don't know that this is going to be an easy relationship either. I think in many respects it will be as difficult at a personal level to deal with Erdogan as it is to deal with Putin in Russia. I think there will be the effort to try to find areas of cooperation with Turkey. Why the Karabakh issue, I think, is particularly important in this regard. But I think it's going to be a tricky relationship, and it's going to take some time, I think, for both Washington and Ankara to get their feet on the ground again. With a new administration in D.C. So I don't expect any radical departures unless there's some incident that arises in connection with Syria or something I can't predict right now. On the Karabakh thing, we've recognized from when I was ambassador and went out there in April of 1994 that Turkey was, I think, of all the regional powers, the most influential in Baku. That has not changed over time. I'm a bit curious by some of the commentators who kind of make a big deal of what's happened since the beginning of 2020 as something new in terms of Russian and Turkish engagement. It's nothing new. I mean, it's been there all the while. When I was there and it was just literally less than a year after President Elchibey was removed from power and Heydar Aliyev assumed power in Azerbaijan. But Elchibey used to wear a lapel pin, which was an image of Ataturk. And the idea of one people, two nations wasn't something that's been created in the last decade. I mean, he and the Turks were talking about the same thing back then. I think what is, however, different now is the apparent, well, certainly the presence of Russian peacekeepers in Azerbaijan and the apparent desire, and this is my interpretation, of the Baku authorities to see Turkey as somehow a balancing presence in Azerbaijan because the Russian peacekeepers are where they are. I'm not sure that's a good idea myself either. I don't think if we're going to engage both Russia and Turkey in settling the Karabakh issue, it shouldn't be with the idea of how do you balance them out. It should be with the idea of how do you use their respective influence with the parties, Armenia and Azerbaijan respectively, and cooperate with the international community, which everyone recognizes is going to be necessary if you're going to rebuild the horrendous damage that has taken place in the occupied territories and in Karabakh itself. Need to be thinking in more positive terms than some sort of great game where Azerbaijan is playing these two regional parties against each other. Not to say that shouldn't be a concern, but it shouldn't be a concern for the U.S. So what we want to do is to engage Turkey positively. I would urge there not be any Turkish bases in Azerbaijan. I think the coordinating center with Russia and Turkey cooperating there is enough. But what always struck me about Azerbaijan from going back to the Alchevate period was that they were able to navigate a withdrawal of the former Soviet troops from Azerbaijan, except for the radar station at Gabala. So that unique among the countries in the South Caucasus and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, there was no Russian military presence. And that was maintained for almost 30 years until now with the end of the war. I guess we can debate whether it was a good idea or not to allow Russia peacekeepers in, but I don't think they're going to go away now that they're there. And the question is, how can the U.S. cooperate with other countries to make sure that they're there and playing a positive role as opposed to getting back to some great game?
Well, and the question is, how long will they be there? Will they increase this is something that we're definitely keeping our eyes on, is the Russian.
I keep reminding people that what happened on November 9, November 10 of 2020 was not an agreement. This was not a document that was signed by the presidents of Azerbaijan and Russia and the prime minister of Armenia. It was a statement. It was a statement that was issued in the name of all three, and it only talks about a ceasefire, the PKO operation, return of refugees and IDPs in some ill-defined way in relationship to the UN, and then the need for these corridors to open. Now, all of this is wonderful stuff. I mean, you would want this if there was an agreement, but there isn't an agreement. There is not an agreement. There is not an agreement for Russian peacekeeping forces to be where they are. It was a statement of acceptance, and they're there for 5 years.
Well, we will keep our fingers crossed that that's
Well, I don't mind them being there in 5 years with a totally changed environment. I mean, think back to the again, back to the Balkans and Bosnia and Herzegovina. 25 years ago, 2020, is the anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords. And it took 50,000 plus NATO troops, plus Russia, plus Ukraine. I mean, Russians were there as well, but part of a larger peacekeeping operation. But to implement that treaty, now, that was an agreement signed to the parties to the conflict. So there were commitments embodied there that aren't in this. So again, I'm not, given where we are, I'm not opposed to Russian troops being part of a peacekeeping operation that by definition will have to be larger if it's going to deal with all the aspects that are being discussed now. But will they, the current configuration, I don't see them leaving in 5 years. I see, my experience in Bosnia is any indication, the Russians will be pushing the envelope in terms of what their troops do, how many there are, where they come from. So that's going to be very, very tricky. And I think where we're really going to see the problem is, I'm not sure what to call this. What's left of what used to be we called Nagorno-Karabakh. I see in at least some of the translations in English is referred to as Upper Karabakh. I don't know if that's an expression that has wide currency, but who's going to kind of administer that, make sure there are no arms coming back and forth between Armenia itself and what Stepanakert and surrounding territories? Will this monitoring mission, Turkish-Russian, have any role in that? I'm not sure. So this is going to be tough. And if I were Putin, I would be very worried about the spring, not just because of Navalny, but once the weather gets better in the South Caucasus, and because we have a ceasefire that is under this statement, which has no formal standing, there's going to be tendencies for people on both sides who have extreme views that have solidified after the war to start fighting again. You know, there's just too much unsettled business there, and unfortunately, we haven't made the kind of progress that I'd hoped would be making toward a peace process that engaged Armenians and Azerbaijanis in talking about how do we separate forces and, you know, ensure that we don't go back to war again. So that can't be in Putin's interest if he's worried about internal problems in Russia itself. He doesn't need more than he already has in the near abroad, and so I think he'll have his eye on that as well. What that means for the Russian presence there, I don't know. Would the Russians bring in more troops to keep that from happening? Whatever the statement says, I don't know. But I think it's important to observe what will be going on the ground between now and better weather.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I want to focus back on something that you've mentioned a couple of times, which is the climate issue. The U.S. president has already brought the U.S. back into the Paris Climate Agreement, the Accord, and the administration is also now planning a climate summit. Could this move to pay more attention to climate issues signal the last chapter of the oil and gas industry? And how will climate change policies affect Azerbaijan? I mean, you hinted at this already. So,
yeah. Well, let me just start from the kind of the Paris re-entry in the Paris Agreement. Again, it's part of Biden's we're back. We're back. We're going to be back in the Paris Agreement framework, and John Kerry will not be a shrinking violet, if you want to use those terms, when it comes to aggressively pushing for greater global cooperation on climate change beyond what the commitments were, which were, after all, national commitments freely entered into, in Paris. To do that, the world has a China and a India problem, because the biggest contributors to CO2 emissions today are China and India because they're coal-fired electrical power systems. China's made this commitment of, no carbon electrical generation by 2060. None of us are going to be around in 2060, I think, to check up on them. But there's going to be a real effort on solidifying and advancing international cooperation. So that's going to be at the heart of almost everything the United States does, and globally and nationally. What does this mean for Azerbaijan? Well, let's just assume that we end up going toward this low, no carbon world in the 2035, 2050 period. Azerbaijan has big plans to further develop both the Shah Deniz gas and ACG gas, deepwater ACG gas, as well as this memorandum of understanding with Turkmenistan to develop offshore, still contested waters of the Caspian. So I ask myself, when I see what's going on in financial markets today and how the lenders who traditionally have supported the international oil companies and national oil companies in developing oil and gas resources, they're going to be shifting their attention elsewhere. Where will the money come from to do this? I do not see any real interest in new pipelines. So I really wonder where that will fit in. But the talk in the U.S. press, the European press about the future of oil and gas is all very bleak. Companies are cutting back. BP, I don't think Azerbaijan has heard the last word on where BP is going to be in the future in terms of new investment in offshore Caspian. And I think the markets are not going to be growing for either oil and gas. And the gas markets in Europe is going to be much more competitive because it's not just Russia. Azerbaijan is not a major, will not be a major supplier of gas, even though it's important gas to get to Europe. But when it comes to expanding that, I don't think the Russians are going to be interested in giving up market share. And you have LNG now that's coming from the Gulf, from the U.S., interestingly enough, into Europe, and that's competing with new gas that Azerbaijan's planning for. And I don't believe, I know the rhetoric is there, but I see no evidence that there's been a real commitment to take specific actions to decrease dependency on oil and gas exports from Azerbaijan for the future. And I don't worry about Saudi Arabia. I worry about Azerbaijan. I worry about the medium and smaller producers in Africa and the Middle East who are going to be in the process of this transition to renewable energy and low carbon based energy, stuck with stranded assets that there may not be a market for. That may be overly bleak, but people are talking like that. And what bothers me in the commitment that the Biden administration and the proponents of low carbon, no carbon futures, they don't take into account the damage that is going to be done, not just on coal miners in West Virginia and Wyoming in the U.S., but what about the economies of Azerbaijan? As I say, Angola, some of the smaller producers in Latin America. They're going to be harmed in this, and I'm not sure the world has figured out a way to deal with that, and they need to in the process. So I think Azerbaijan has a much more difficult future ahead because of this, and there's certainly the expectation will be that oil and gas, as it had been a priority during the Trump administration, will certainly not be a priority for this administration, and therefore the importance of Azerbaijan as a supplier for U.S. interests and European needs will decrease, and that's going to be a new reality. I don't have a solution. I just know that it's time to get a lot of very smart people, sitting down and talking, both outsiders and people inside Azerbaijan, talking about what happens next. How do you continue prosperity and economic growth that's necessary to rebuild the occupied territories, necessary to address the social challenges within Azerbaijan itself, and do it without oil and gas?
Well, that's something that we'll be talking about, I'm sure, for the next few years pretty extensively. The Biden administration has also promised a democracy summit. So what do you think? Will the leaders from Azerbaijan be invited to the democracy summit?
I don't know what the criteria are for who would be invited to the democracy summit. My personal view is no, there just isn't that commitment. I don't think Hungary would be invited to the democracy summit. I'm not sure Turkey should be. I'm not even sure the United States should host it, given some of the things that have gone on in the U.S. That's a flip comment, bad effort at humor. But I really would want to be very sure that we're not encouraging existing patterns of behavior which are not democratic in countries like Azerbaijan and Hungary and others, by simply inviting them to a summit for public relations purposes, either for the U.S. or for these countries themselves. I guess if I had anything to say about it, I'd hold off on a democracy summit, but somebody else is making the commitment. But I do think that it does indicate unlike during the last 4 years, how people, conduct their internal politics is going to be very much a visible issue that affects, foreign relations as well. How much, I don't know. The administration has spoken out very strongly about what's gone on in Myanmar, Burma, the last month. What happens beyond, I know sanctions again, but I think it's one indication that developments like that will not be ignored by a Biden administration. That they will be front and center. And again, at least on a rhetorical level, we're going to be holding people to a higher standard on that. Whether that applies to who gets invited to a democracy summit, I don't know.
The invitations will be something to watch, that's for sure.
Yeah, oh yeah, I want to see who gets invited or who doesn't get invited. Yeah.
Well, I guess it also depends on what is the agenda of it. Maybe it is to, inform people that this is a good way to move, to try to build your democracy and not break it down, and maybe some strategies on how to better affect democracy. But it'll be interesting to see the invitation list and the agenda.
Yeah. No, but you make a good point. I mean, what's the purpose of it? It's a gathering as it would have been 10 years ago when we all felt that, democracy was on a march. It was to other countries than those who had been the beneficiaries of it in the post-war period, to today where it's not. I mean, we're seeing steps back, maybe not as extreme as in Burma, Myanmar, but still, it's a problem. I don't, again, my experience when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the UN on international affairs, UN affairs in the State Department. We always, looked upon international gatherings as an opportunity to, build coalitions and strengthen commitments to basic principles that the organizations were all about, whether it was trade, the environment, or human rights. And I don't know that that's a strategy made for the 21st century. I don't think we can use that as a starting point. So it'll be very interesting, in addition to the invitation list, to really get a sense of what the summit is going to be about, what the agenda is, and what happens after the summit. Everybody will want to come to Washington to, meet with, assuming, of course, we can travel.
Right.
But, everybody will want to have that contact with Biden and the Biden administration, and that's a good thing. But we'll just have to see what the summit looks like, and, as you say, what the invitation list is.
So I can't remember who said it, but we have to all agree that democracy is the worst form of government except everything else, right?
Yeah. Well, we're finding that out in the United States. I mean,
right.
The idea that somehow we were a city on the hill when it came to democracy, in one sense, was true, because the experiment had, is one that had been, put into place 1776, and was an ongoing effort. But I don't think.
It's fragile. Yeah, that's what we've learned. It's not as solid as we think.
That's the most important part. And the fragility is underpinned by divisions in our society, which will not easily go away just by electing one president or another. Right. So that's going to be the challenge of what's the image of the United States that the Biden administration will project at a democracy summit. That will be very interesting.
Well, on the same note, finally, I want to talk to you about what you've thread through all of my questions almost, is the issue of human rights. Finally, President Biden said yesterday that he's in favor of rejoining the Human Rights Council, which has been noted to be flawed, but he still thinks that it's important. And he also said that human rights need to be integrated as a core strategic consideration into all the U.S. does, including the Defense Department. So that means that human rights, he said this in his speech at the State Department, human rights office in every combatant command. What might that look like, and is this sustainable?
Well, in some respects, it's like the climate change issue. I mean, he's defined climate issue as a whole of government, and the expectation is it's not just John Kerry and a few people scattered around different operational ministries, if you want to think in those terms, like the State Department or Department of Energy. It's a whole of government, including the Defense Department. I do not know how human rights then will be merged into the combatant commands. I think obviously at a minimum level, the kinds of training that the United States provides to other countries will focus more on human rights issues now, and there will be concern about weapons sales. As to whether, certain, and we've already seen that in Yemen, in the case of where the decision not to sell certain types of weapons, which have led to human rights abuses, if you will, because of the ongoing war there. I think that will be another element. I think there will be less of a sort of a excuse of a strategic relationship between the U.S. military and another country as justifying not paying attention to human rights. I don't think I've said that right. In other words, we can't use the so-called strategic relationship with a country to justify not speaking out on human rights violations which are going on. So I guess the combatant commanders are very important in terms of implementing U.S. defense policy. They are the point of contact and can be very positive in relations with militaries around the world. But this will be another priority that they'll have to incorporate in how they carry out their military responsibilities, along with climate change. Quite frankly, I mean, there'll be people from DOD who are going to be looking at how the combatant commanders behave. And last year I was part of a study group that looked at the impact of climate change on U.S. security interests and kind of broke down the impacts by combatant commands. And so that on at least the climate part, I mean, you already have a sensitivity built in that is going to, in a sense, be a step ahead of the sensitivity on the human rights side.
Well, they go hand in hand. I agree with you. Climate is a human right in many ways. Attention to climate.
Yeah, exactly. And people who in drought situations around the world where the U.S. military does get involved directly and facilitating assistance. That's one very dramatic example of where the two can come together.
Well, we will keep our eyes on all of these relationships, and we appreciate your time, Ambassador Kauzlarich, and I hope we can come back to you again soon, and when things change or when things stay the same. So thank you again.
I look forward to that, and I look forward to the time when we can talk about a permanent peace in the South Caucasus, so that we all can get to work on these other very important issues as well. So thank you for your questions.
You bet. Thanks.
Okay.